He knocked by accident, then knocked again. It's funny how the smallest actions can sometimes lead to the most significant changes in our lives. That's exactly what happened to Michael on a rainy Tuesday evening in October. You know those moments when you're going about your day, following your usual routine, and then something happens that throws everything off course? This is a story about one of those moments. A simple knock on a door that wasn't meant to happen, followed by another knock that would change everything. Michael wasn't the type of person who sought out new experiences or unexpected encounters. At 32, he had settled comfortably into his life as a graphic designer working from his apartment in the city. He had his routines, his favorite coffee shop, and a small circle of friends he'd known since college. Change wasn't something he particularly welcomed, and spontaneity wasn't his strong suit. But life has a way of pushing us into situations we never planned for, doesn't it? Let me set the scene for you. It was around 7:30 in the evening, and Michael had just returned from a particularly exhausting day. He'd had to meet with a difficult client who kept changing requirements for a project due at the end of the week. The rain had started just as he left the client's office, and naturally, he'd forgotten his umbrella. By the time he reached his apartment building, his shoes were squelching with water, his hair was plastered to his forehead, and his mood was about as dark as the storm clouds overhead. The apartment building where Michael lived was an older structure, with narrow hallways and doors that were too close together. He'd lived there for 5 years and rarely interacted with his neighbors beyond a polite nod in the hallway or a brief exchange about the weather in the elevator. That evening, as he fumbled with his keys, his mind was elsewhere, thinking about the changes he'd need to make to the client's project, wondering if he had anything in his refrigerator that could pass for dinner, and calculating how many hours of sleep he could get if he worked until midnight. That's when it happened. As Michael reached for his door, his wet hand slipped, and his knuckles rapped against the door. Not his door, but the door of apartment 4B, directly across from his own. It wasn't a loud knock, just a gentle tap really, but in the quiet hallway, it seemed to echo. Michael froze. He'd never spoken to the person who lived in 4B. In fact, he wasn't even sure who lived there. The apartment had been vacant for months, and he vaguely recalled seeing moving boxes outside the door a few weeks ago, but he'd been too preoccupied with a deadline to pay much attention. For a moment, Michael stood perfectly still, hoping that perhaps the knock had been too soft to be heard. He could just quickly unlock his door and slip inside before anyone answered. But then he heard movement from inside apartment 4B, the soft padding of footsteps approaching the door. Michael felt his heart rate quicken. What would he say? Sorry, I knocked on your door by accident, seemed ridiculous, even though it was the truth. He could feel heat rising to his face as embarrassment set in. The footsteps stopped on the other side of the door, but it didn't open. Perhaps the occupant was looking through the peephole, trying to determine who had knocked at this hour. Michael shifted uncomfortably, still standing in the hallway with his keys in his hand, his clothes dripping onto the carpet. He should say something, he thought. Explain the mistake. But the words wouldn't come, and the moment stretched awkwardly. Let me explain why this matters. These small, uncomfortable moments often reveal more about us than the big, planned events in our lives. Michael's reaction to this accidental knock was telling him something about himself that he hadn't fully acknowledged, how isolated he had become, how routine had replaced genuine human connection in his life. Standing there in that hallway, he suddenly realized how long it had been since he'd had a conversation with someone new, since he'd stepped outside his carefully constructed comfort zone. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds, the footsteps on the other side of the door retreated. The occupant of 4B had apparently decided not to answer. Michael exhaled slowly, feeling both relieved and, surprisingly, disappointed. He turned back to his own door, managed to get the key in the lock this time, and stepped inside his apartment. Once inside, Michael went through his usual evening routine, changing out of his wet clothes, heating up leftover pasta from the previous night, and settling in front of his computer to work on the client's project. But his mind kept drifting back to that moment in the hallway. Who lived across from him? Why hadn't they opened the door? And why did he care so much about an accidental knock? As the evening wore on, Michael found himself unable to focus on his work. The incident in the hallway had disrupted more than just his routine. It had disturbed something deeper, making him acutely aware of the predictability of his days, the safety of his isolation, and the absence of surprise in his life. He thought about the moving boxes he'd seen, about the new person who now occupied the space across from his own, living their life just a few feet away, yet completely unknown to him. Around 10 p.m., Michael got up from his desk and walked to his front door. He stood there for a moment, listening to the silence of his apartment. Then, before he could talk himself out of it, he opened his door and stepped back into the hallway. He stood in front of apartment 4B, raised his hand, and this time, deliberately knocked on the door. This second knock was different from the first. It was intentional, firm, and clear. As soon as he'd done it, Michael wondered what had possessed him. What would he say when the door opened? "Hi, I'm your neighbor who accidentally knocked on your door earlier and then ran away." It seemed absurd. Yet here he was, standing in the hallway for the second time that evening, waiting for a response from a stranger. The wait was shorter this time. The footsteps approached more quickly, and then the door opened, just a crack at first, secured by a chain. In that small space appeared a woman's face, early 30s, with curious brown eyes and hair pulled back in a messy bun. She looked at Michael with a mixture of caution and interest. "Yes?" she said, her voice neither friendly nor unfriendly, just questioning. Michael cleared his throat. "Hi, I'm Michael from across the hall, apartment 4A. I accidentally knocked on your door earlier. My hand slipped because of the rain, and I just wanted to apologize if I disturbed you." The woman's expression shifted slightly, the caution giving way to something that might have been amusement. "I thought that might have been what happened," she said. "I looked through the peephole and saw you standing there looking panicked. I figured you'd either knocked on the wrong door or were having second thoughts about whatever brought you here." Michael felt a smile tugging at his lips, relief washing over him. "Definitely the first one. But then I couldn't stop thinking about it, and I realized I've lived across from this apartment for years and never properly introduced myself to anyone who's lived here. So hi, I'm Michael," he repeated, feeling somewhat foolish but also strangely liberated. The woman unlatched the chain and opened the door wider. "I'm Emma," she said. "I moved in 3 weeks ago. Nice to finally meet you." Michael from across the hall who knocks accidentally and then knocks again on purpose. There was something about the way she said it, a gentle teasing that acknowledged the oddity of the situation without making it awkward, that immediately put Michael at ease. He noticed now that she was holding a paintbrush, and behind her, the apartment was a chaos of half-unpacked boxes and canvases leaning against walls. "You're an artist?" he asked, genuinely interested. Emma nodded. "I am. I teach art at the community college during the day and work on my own pieces at night. What about you? What do you do when you're not knocking on strangers' doors?" "I'm a graphic designer," Michael replied. "Mostly freelance work for corporate clients. Not quite as creative as what you do, I'm sure." Emma tilted her head slightly. "Creativity comes in many forms," she said. "Would you like to come in for a cup of tea? Fair warning, I haven't fully unpacked yet, so we'd be sitting on boxes." Michael hesitated for just a moment. This wasn't part of his routine. He had work to finish, emails to send, a schedule to maintain. But then again, wasn't that exactly what had been bothering him earlier? The predictability, the isolation, the safety of his well-ordered life? "I'd like that," he said, surprising himself with how much he meant it. As he stepped into Emma's apartment, Michael was struck by how different it felt from his own, despite having the same layout. Where his space was minimalist and orderly, hers was vibrant and chaotic. Colorful textiles draped over half-assembled furniture, paintings in various stages of completion occupied every available wall space, and plants, so many plants, filled the corners and windowsills. It was as if the apartment itself was a canvas, and Emma was in the midst of creating something beautiful out of the blank space she'd been given. "Sorry about the mess," Emma said, clearing a stack of books from a chair so Michael could sit. "Moving is always chaotic, and I tend to unpack the art supplies before anything practical." "It's not a mess," Michael found himself saying. "It's alive. My place looks like a furniture showroom in comparison." Emma laughed as she filled a kettle and set it on the stove. "I've lived in too many sterile apartments. I promised myself this one would have character from day one." She gestured around the room. "Hence the explosion of color before I've even found all my kitchen utensils." As Emma prepared the tea, they fell into conversation that flowed with surprising ease. Michael learned that Emma had moved to the city after ending a long-term relationship in Chicago. She spoke about it matter-of-factly, without bitterness, describing it as a necessary ending that had freed both her and her ex-partner to pursue different paths. There was something refreshing about her openness, her willingness to share parts of herself with someone she'd just met. In turn, Michael found himself talking about his own life, his work, his small circle of friends, his routines. As he described his typical day, he could hear how it sounded: safe, predictable, controlled. But Emma didn't seem to judge. Instead, she asked questions that made him reflect on why he'd chosen this path, what he found satisfying about his work, what dreams he might have set aside along the way. "So what made you knock the second time?" Emma asked as they were finishing their tea. "You could have just gone back to your apartment and forgotten about the whole thing." Michael considered the question. "Honestly, I'm not entirely sure. Something about that accidental knock made me realize how disconnected I've been. Not just from neighbors, but from, I don't know, from the unexpected parts of life. Everything in my days is so planned, so routine. That accidental knock was the first unscripted moment I've had in longer than I can remember." Emma nodded thoughtfully. "And how does it feel? This unscripted moment we're having now?" "Good," Michael said, surprised by the simplicity of his answer and the truth behind it. "It feels really good." They talked for nearly 2 hours that evening. When Michael finally returned to his apartment, he felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time: a sense of anticipation, of wondering what might happen next. The client project that had seemed so urgent earlier now took its proper place in the scheme of things, important, but not all-consuming. He finished what needed to be done and went to bed thinking not about deadlines or emails, but about Emma's laugh and the way her eyes lit up when she talked about her art. Over the next few weeks, what began with an accidental knock developed into a genuine friendship. Michael and Emma began to share meals, first in her apartment as she gradually unpacked and organized her space, then in his as he became more comfortable with inviting someone into his carefully ordered world. They discovered shared interests in obscure documentaries and spicy food, and differences that led to playful debates about everything from politics to the best way to organize a bookshelf. Emma introduced Michael to her art world, taking him to gallery openings and studio spaces where her friends gathered. He found himself enjoying these new experiences, these glimpses into a community so different from his own professional circle. In return, Michael helped Emma navigate the practicalities of living in their neighborhood, the best local shops, the shortcuts to avoid traffic, the restaurants worth trying, and those best avoided. One evening, about 2 months after that first accidental knock, Michael and Emma were sitting on her now-furnished balcony, sharing a bottle of wine and watching the city lights. Emma had just finished a series of paintings for an upcoming exhibition, and Michael had completed a major project for a new client who had been referred to him through Emma's connections. "You know," Emma said, refilling their glasses, "I almost didn't answer the door that second time you knocked." Michael looked at her in surprise. "Really? Why not?" Emma shrugged. "Self-preservation, I guess. I'd just moved to a new city after ending a 5-year relationship. I wasn't looking to make connections right away. I was in my protective bubble, focusing on my art, avoiding complications." "What made you open the door then?" Michael asked. Emma smiled. "Curiosity. The look on your face through the peephole that first time, so mortified over an accidental knock. And then when you came back, I wanted to know what kind of person would do that. Who knocks by accident, and then comes back to knock again on purpose?" It seemed like the beginning of an interesting story. Michael laughed. "And was it?" "An interesting story. Still being written," Emma replied, her eyes meeting his. "But yes, I'd say it's turning out to be quite interesting." In that moment, Michael realized how much had changed since that rainy evening when his wet hand had slipped and accidentally knocked on Emma's door. His life was no longer just about routines and predictability. There were now unexpected dinners, spontaneous art gallery visits, and conversations that stretched late into the night. His work had improved too. Emma's influence had brought a new creativity to his designs, a willingness to take risks that his clients were responding to positively. Most importantly, he had learned something about himself, that the safety of routine had been both a comfort and a limitation. That accidental knock, and his decision to knock again, had been a small act of courage that opened a door to not just a new friendship, but to a new way of living, one that embraced the unplanned moments and found joy in the unexpected. As they sat there on the balcony, the city spread out before them, Michael thought about how life's most significant changes often begin with the smallest actions. A slip of the hand, a knock on a door, a moment of courage to step outside the familiar. And he was grateful, so grateful, that his hand had slipped that rainy evening and that he had found the courage to knock again. The story of the accidental knock and the intentional one that followed reminds us that life's most meaningful connections often begin in unexpected ways. It teaches us that sometimes we need to embrace the unscripted moments, to follow the curious pathways that open up when we least expect them. And perhaps most importantly, it shows us that behind every door, literal and metaphorical, there may be someone waiting whose presence in our lives will change everything. If only we have the courage to knock, to introduce ourselves, to begin. So the next time you find yourself standing in a hallway, hesitating before a door, whether it's a new relationship, a career opportunity, or simply a chance to break out of your routine, remember Michael and Emma. Remember that sometimes the most important knock is the one that comes after the accident, the one you choose to make despite your fear or uncertainty. Because on the other side of that door might be exactly the person, the opportunity, or the change that your life has been waiting for. Total_char_count, 13,860.